So I want to look a bit now at the issue of nurses and trauma, because I think this is really what lies at the heart of how nurses really struggle with their work. And trauma we can understand as being a very subjective thing. The important thing is not the experience, but how the person experiences it. And we can understand it as being a situation in which they feel that the resources they have don't match the challenge, the demands that are being made on them, and they become overwhelmed. And that's trauma across the board. So within nursing, we talk about adverse childhood experiences quite a lot at the chrysalis effect. And I've touched a bit here on what sort of a person becomes a nurse. And really going sometimes back to birth with problems with attachment disorders, but also that family dynamic, what the child's experiences are that set them up for a whole lifetime of beliefs and behaviours. How should they behave towards other people? What are their responsibilities? What's important? And that all feeds into the person who actually then chooses to become the nurse. And without going into a lot of detail here, some of that foundational research into adverse childhood experiences establishes the connection between those early traumas and later chronic conditions across the board, but chronic exhaustive conditions is very much part of that. So thinking about the workplace, so what happens to that person who comes into nursing often with a high ACE score, had already had trauma as a child, and they come into a situation in which small t traumas are almost normal. And by small t traumas, I mean those things which overwhelm on a kind of constant drip day-to-day basis. So in childhood, they may have had small t traumas by being regularly humiliated within the family, or living in a situation which was very unstable. So maybe they had parents who had depression or illnesses, they had to look after them. And so every day was about, how can I keep safe? What do I need to do to make everything okay now? And on the wards, that translates into a situation where we have an NHS where the word crisis has been used since the 1940s. And already by the time I did my thesis at the beginning of the 21st century, that was really beginning to feel like a word that was so overused it was meaningless. The NHS is just by definition in crisis all the time. And what we've seen then with the pandemic is it escalating beyond anything I think that we can really fully comprehend, and the kind of situations that we saw people within the health service working through the pandemic, I think were quite traumatizing for people on the outside, never mind those who were actually having to do it. One of the interesting things I found was I thought I'd come to terms with leaving nursing until we were called out to clap. And I just felt such intense guilt that I wasn't there. I'm feeling quite teary now at the moment with this, that I should have been there and that I'd abandoned my colleagues. So that small t trauma, going into work, feeling overwhelmed, not having the physical resources, not having enough people to do the work, often means that you're in a constant state of not being able to meet the demands that are being made upon you, and living in a constant state of fight or flight, and the body being in that high stress level all the time. And we add on top of that the direct traumatic experiences that nurses have. Now, this might be, for example, we know that there is a very high rate of abuse of staff. So verbal abuse, but sometimes even physical attacks from patients, from their families. We get very high pressure situations, and that often translates over into attacks on staff. So it's not only the traumatic experiences of that, but the possibility that it might happen, being aware that the tension's building up. We also have a real serious problem, I think, within the nursing profession with bullying, and that's been well documented. And that's really not surprising when you think that this is a group which actually has very limited power to control its own workload, its own context, and that what happens in groups like that is often that tension is turned inward against each other. And I quite often find that people outside nursing are very surprised, because you would associate nursing with care. Nurses are really caring people. And that is the case for the vast majority of nurses, and particularly in relation to their patients. But nurses can also be really vicious to each other. And I think sometimes that's something that people from the outside are really quite surprised about. In fact, I came across an article while I was studying that said, why do nurses eat their own young? And my first response was, what? Yeah, that's really a bit extreme. And then I thought, no, but we do. Some of the things that student nurses are subjected to by other nurses are really, really quite brutal. So just to give you a couple of examples from my own experience. My very first week on the wards when I arrived in Edinburgh, I was terrified, and my whole class were talking about, oh, what if somebody has a cardiac arrest and I don't know what to do, and really catastrophizing around this stuff. And we were going into a situation where that potentially could happen. And for me, it did. So in my very first week on the wards, I was asked to take the tea trolley around, which seemed a very simple thing. But I approached a man sitting up in bed and I said, would you like a cup of tea? And he keeled over and died. And all of a sudden, I was in the middle of this whirl of activity with curtains swishing and people rushing to the bedside. And all I could do as a new student nurse was cling on to my tea trolley. And I remember the charge nurse saying, just keep going. Go and give everybody a cup of tea and keep it all calm. And that was the last conversation I had about that experience. Nobody came to me later on in that shift and said, are you okay? Nobody, not the other students, not the staff. And I went home in absolute pieces. But what I'd learned was that my job when things went to hell was just to keep going and to keep smiling. And that was a really powerful lesson, and one that fed into my illness later on. Another experience is, again, as a student, I was on accident emergency at the Royal Infirmary in Edinburgh on a Saturday night. And the charge nurse said, can you sit with this man? And he was lying on a gurney. He really, really did look unwell. So I did, and I sat with him. And then he rolled over, he vomited all over the floor, and he died. And I rushed over to the charge nurse. I was calling for help. And she said, oh, I thought that was going to happen. I just didn't want him to be on his own. And again, that was the end of the conversation. I was just left with that. What do I do? I'm a nurse. That's what I've got to do. On to the next patient. And that really is brutal when you've just often come out of school, you're just early into the profession. These are really powerful lessons about how you behave and what's being expected of you. You have to be strong and you have to be able to cope with whatever is thrown at you. Then we come on to the question of vicarious trauma. And this is when you're in a situation where you are watching other people who are being overwhelmed. And inevitably, as a nurse, as a doctor, as anybody working on wards, you're coming across this on an almost daily basis. You're faced with illness and disability and death and fear. And remember back to that ME profile of the empath. If you don't understand that you're an empath, you're soaking up all this emotion on the wards. And then you don't have the tools. You don't know what to do with it. So what you tend to do is you dissociate from it. You push it away. And this leads us on to the last aspect of trauma that I'd like to touch on. And this is actually something I can only talk from my own experience. And this is normalized trauma. And I have not been able to find this written about anywhere, except in relation to race. So there is somebody who has talked about normalized trauma, where there is racial abuse and where a group of people, again, have no power to actually change what happens to them. So they tend to just say, that's life, get on with it. And that's very much what happens in nursing. And I don't think I really fully understood that actually until this year. And what really brought it home to me was watching movies with my kids who really like Marvel films. And there's quite a lot of violence in there. And I suddenly realized that I kept having to look away. And I didn't want to see the dismemberments and the blood and the violence and everything. And yet in the past as a nurse, I was really proud of not being squeamish and thinking I can go into the worst situation and just, right, okay, what do we do here? And I'll be fine. And it doesn't touch me. But having been through the recovery process and having been through some trauma therapy and worked on my dissociation, I've lost that defense. And it is really very difficult to watch that sort of thing now. And another aspect of this is that when I was being investigated by a neurologist, I had a pinprick test done. So she stuck pins into my hands to see whether I could feel them, and I couldn't. It just felt like pressure. And I went home and I tested myself, my whole body, and I found that there were, I think, actually a band around my waist where if you stuck a pin in me, I could feel it as a pinprick, and otherwise it was just pressure. My mind had become completely disconnected from the signals that my body was giving. And I think that was very much tied up with my pain and my fibromyalgia, as I was no longer actually in my body anymore. But having gone through the recovery process and addressed those traumas and reconnected, if you stick a pin in me now, it very much will hurt. So please don't. But that's the power of normalized trauma, to go through your life thinking, oh, that's normal, that's every day, I can cope with it, it'll be fine. If you found this video helpful, please do click on like below and subscribe to my channel. You might also like to hop across using the links to my Facebook or LinkedIn pages, where you'll find much more content.